Douglas Sirk was a major, major influence, certainly for the early films that I did, and as I began to shape myself as a filmmaker, especially Written on the Wind. And, you know, if you see The Loveless, you can obviously see the relationship between the two. What a beautiful quote of his. This is of Douglas Sirk. "The angles are the director's thoughts, the lighting is his philosophy." Isn't that beautiful? I was making a transition between working in the art world and beginning to make short films, and then the ideas for the films became a little bit longer and finally ultimately feature length. But in that transition, I was doing a graduate degree at Columbia University. And it was at Columbia that I first became familiar with Douglas Sirk and virtually all of his films. And at the same time, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, as well as extraordinary other filmmakers. But somehow the Fassbinder-Sirk kind of matrix began to kind of play on my imagination. And I think The Loveless was really a product of those two extreme influences. And I was really, really taken with his work. And I had a professor at the time, Andrew Saris, extraordinary film critic, who was so passionate about Douglas Sirk's work. And so his presentation of the material was so rich and so vivid as we began to kind of dissect and deconstruct the film in front of us. And it left a real indelible memory. My first encounter with Douglas Sirk was in Locarno, at the Locarno Film Festival, where The Loveless played for the first time. It was its world premiere. And it was my first film. It was a very nerve-wracking experience, but through the sheer good fortune of knowing Matthias Brunner, I met Douglas Sirk and was able to kind of commiserate with a fellow filmmaker, although a great inspiration and luminary, but nonetheless somebody who gave me great kind of resolve and confidence. And I invited him to the screening, which took place in this beautiful piazza at night under a full moon and a million stars. And it was very difficult for him to see at the time. He was having some trouble with his eyes, but he came nonetheless. And I remember his wife steadying him as he walked down the stairs to a place very near the front of the screen so he could be as close to the image as possible. And I think even though it was the first screening of the film, my first film, a world premiere, what perhaps was most important to me was the fact that Douglas Sirk, this master filmmaker, great, great, great artist, tremendous inspiration, was sitting maybe 20 feet away from me in the theater watching the screen. And that was where my focus went. And afterward, I remember, you know, I said, what did you think about? Obviously, I was kind of paying homage to him in the film, to Written on the Wind, with the character who had the beautiful red Corvette. And I think he was really touched. So it was a very good experience. I felt very intimidated to actually meet Douglas Sirk for the first time. My feeling about the film was that they were so powerful, so imagistic, so powerful, so emotionally acute. And yet when you meet him, there's something so gentle and kind, and again, so available about him that it then completes a whole picture. You know, you realize that the man and the work as perhaps any artist in any work, there's a very complex collage there. It's not just comprised of a single idea by any means, and it's always enlightening to experience that. In Written on the Wind, I'd say there's something there's a kind of romance with the West, and there's a kind of anarchistic quality. There's a certain degree of nihilism, and I think it's that portrait of nihilism that was really rich and evocative that I sort of borrowed and I believe was a tremendous, tremendous influence when Monty Montgomery and I were working on the script and then ultimately the movie, that it was that real kind of psychological portrait of somebody in a desperate situation, but yet there's something kind of lush and exotic about the visual surface. So there was this kind of interesting juxtaposition of this nihilistic interior and this incredibly lush, almost exotic exterior that was pure art. In this interview, once again, the point of connection was through Matthias Brunner, who asked if I would come to Lugano, meet with Douglas Sirk, and do the interview. And of course, again, I was honored. And by this time, I felt kind of comfortable with him, even though I was still in awe and could not shake the feeling of being so kind of reverentially impressed. But kind of felt comfortable enough to talk to him and kind of begin to try to delve into his process, perhaps in the hope that I could enlighten myself to my own. And it was a very moving experience. I mean, the background to the article was him talking about his life, leaving Germany, coming to America, the chicken farm, he and Hilda raising chickens in California, and I just kept thinking, this incredible filmmaker working with these chickens. I mean, it was such a, I don't know, juxtaposition of opposites, and yet it made so much sense. There was something so touching about it. And so feeling a kind of closeness and a comfort level, you know, we began to speak about his work, and I felt that he was very candid and open and available to my questions, and it was really, you know, a pretty pivotal moment for me, I suppose, as a filmmaker. It's interesting, in this interview, we begin to talk about psychoanalysis and film, and he mentions, for instance, it's the beginning of the sort of fascination with psychoanalysis in America for film. And it's interesting because Written on the Wind is obviously a very kind of, from a psychoanalytic standpoint, I mean, it's kind of a psychosexual melodrama that is, you know, it's almost like a kind of dream state of something incredibly passionate and erotic and evocative. And, you know, it seduces you and takes you into this kind of, I don't know, this sort of extremely dramatic, emotionally high-pitched drama that never lets up until the end. You know, it just stays at this fever pitch. And, you know, I think that when we were discussing it at Columbia, we would perhaps really discuss it almost exclusively in psychoanalytic terms. And it was just very, very, left an incredible impression, especially if you're a filmmaker just beginning to make films, and realize this incredible pull of, you know, the relationship, the contract almost between the audience and the screen, and how that how that creates a kind of dialectic between the two. One thing that Douglas said to me that I found so not only astonishing, but has stayed with me forever is about adaptations of a book. And at the time, I was hoping to do an adaptation of a Patricia Highsmith book called The Blunderer. And she was living in Ticino, so I was able to meet with her and Douglas Sirk on the same trip. And he said to me, he said, remember, I was so excited about this book, and it was a tremendous book. Unfortunately, the project never happened, but he said to me, remember that you must never work from a great, great book. Always a book that's a little bit flawed, because the film then has a chance to be great. If you only work with a book, you know, that is already magnificent, the film has nowhere to go. So that was an incredible revelation, and made me relax a little bit about attempting this project. Douglas Sirk was, of course, a great, great, great master of melodrama. And I think, you know, that's a very rich context for film. But at the same time, as a filmmaker, I think you kind of try to not contextualize and not work within prescribed niches, let's say. You know, you want to always try to invent a new way to describe something, work on material that hasn't been described before. So I suppose to say he's a master of melodrama is absolutely true, but at the same time, you know, you want to think that the definition is far more elastic and, I don't know, more influential. You know, we're really a product, certainly as filmmakers or artists, you know, you're a product of all that has inspired you. And he's certainly a rich and indelible inspiration that will always inform me, no matter what work I do.